What if everything we know about the birth of civilization is wrong? What if humanity's true story didn't begin 5,000 years ago, but ended 12,000 years before Christus, in a single night of fire, ice, and flood? Because somewhere in the forgotten past, long before Egypt, Babylon, or Rome, the world may have witnessed the fall of a lost people, a civilization erased not by time, but by catastrophe. Around 12,000 years before Christus, the last ice age was collapsing. Massive glaciers, 2 miles thick, began to melt. Oceans rose, climates shifted, and continents trembled. Entire species vanished. Mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. But perhaps something else disappeared too. A chapter of human history we were never meant to remember. Nearly every ancient culture tells of a flood that ended an age. The Sumerians spoke of Ziusudra, the man who survived the great waters. The Maya told of a world destroyed by rain and fire. And in Greek legend, Plato wrote of Atlantis, a great civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. For generations, scholars called these tales myth. Yet modern discoveries are forcing experts to look again. In 2007, researchers studying sediments from North America and Greenland found something extraordinary. A thin, dark layer of ash and melt glass dating to roughly 10,800 before Christus. Within it were traces of rare elements like platinum and iridium, materials often linked with cosmic impacts. This evidence supports what some call the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that a comet or meteor shower struck Earth around 12,800 before Christus, unleashing wildfires, floods, and a deep global freeze. The aftermath was catastrophic. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Temperatures plummeted. And if an advanced coastal society had existed, its cities would now lie buried beneath the ocean floor. Mainstream historians remain skeptical. They find no direct proof of high technology, writing, or organized states that early. But the clues keep appearing. Megalithic ruins like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, dating to around 1,500 before Christus, with precise stonework and astronomical alignment that seem far ahead of their time. So we must ask, were our ancestors truly primitive hunters, or survivors rebuilding from something greater? This is the story of the civilization that may have come before us, a people erased by the earth itself. In the next chapter, we'll descend into the geological evidence, the storms, floods, and sudden climate shifts that marked the end of that forgotten age, and perhaps the beginning of ours. They say the earth changes slowly, that mountains rise over millions of years, and oceans take ages to move. But there was one moment, 12,800 years before Christus, when the earth changed almost overnight. The world was emerging from the last ice age. For thousands of years, frozen sheets of ice had covered North America, Europe, and Asia. Walls of frozen water 2 miles high. Then, in a span of just a few centuries, or perhaps only decades, those walls began to melt. Something had triggered chaos in the climate. Ice cores drilled from Greenland tell the story clearly. Within a single layer of frozen time, the temperature suddenly dropped by more than 10 degrees. It was as if winter had swallowed the world again. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, a mysterious return to glacial cold that lasted for over 1,000 years. But no one truly knows what caused it. Some researchers believe it began with a cosmic strike, a comet fragment or asteroid breaking apart in the atmosphere. The evidence lies hidden in the ground, thin layers of charcoal and melt glass, traces of platinum and iridium, all dated to around 10,800 before Christus. Dr. James Kennett of the University of California found these clues in ancient lake beds and ice layers, suggesting that something explosive, possibly from the heavens, struck the planet. If true, it would have unleashed firestorms across continents, sending soot into the sky and blocking the sun for months. Other scientists argue a different cause, that the collapse of giant ice dams released torrents of fresh water into the North Atlantic, shutting down the ocean currents that carried warmth around the world. Whatever the trigger, the result was the same. The climate convulsed, the sky dimmed, and the world's delicate balance was shattered. For animals, it was the beginning of extinction. For humans, it was the beginning of survival. Imagine waking to find your hunting grounds buried in snow, your rivers frozen, and your herds gone. Tribes scattered, villages vanished, entire regions became unlivable. The seas began to rise, swallowing coastal lands. At its height, the meltwater surged so fast that shorelines could shift by hundreds of meters within a single lifetime. If cities or settlements had existed along those coasts, they would have been erased, their ruins now lying deep beneath the oceans. Ancient traditions echo this moment. In the myths of India, they called it the time of great waters. In Mesopotamia, the flood of the god Enlil swept away the world of men. And in the Americas, the Hopi tell of the previous world destroyed by both fire and ice. Different languages, different lands, yet all remembering the same sudden end. So the earth changed overnight, and with it, the memory of whatever came before was buried under ice, ash, and rising seas. But fragments survived, in legend, in stone, and in the hands of those who lived to tell the tale. When the world began to warm again, it did not happen gently. It came with thunder, with rivers of ice turning to floods, and with oceans that rose higher than any memory could hold. It was around 11,600 years before Christus, the moment the Ice Age truly ended and the old Great Melt began. Across what is now North America, walls of ice, taller than mountains, cracked and broke apart. Each rupture released lakes the size of inland seas, billions of tons of water crashing toward the oceans. The land roared like a living thing. In just a few generations, coastlines vanished, rivers changed course, and valleys became lakes. Scientists studying meltwater channels in Canada and the northern United States found scars still visible today, deep gouges carved into rock by unimaginable floods. They call them the scablands, remnants of water moving faster than any river known to man. Some geologists estimate that single bursts carried more water than all the rivers on Earth combined. The oceans responded violently. Sea levels surged more than 100 meters as the ice collapsed. In places like what is now the North Sea, land bridges disappeared beneath the waves. The area once connecting Britain to Europe, known to researchers as Doggerland, became an Atlantis of its own, drowned forever beneath the cold grey sea. But the melt didn't just reshape land, it reshaped life itself. Plants and animals migrated or died. Human tribes were forced to move with the changing world, from the melting plains of Eurasia to the highlands of Anatolia and beyond. Those who lived near the coasts had the most to lose. If a civilization had thrived along those shores, its cities would now rest under hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of all but the deepest sonar. In the legends of ancient peoples, this time is remembered with grief. The Egyptians spoke of a period when the Nile rose beyond measure. The Maya described the great flood that came from the mouth of the sky. And in Greek tradition, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a deluge sent by the gods, mirrors the very same catastrophe. It is as if humanity's earliest stories are the collective memory of the Great Melt. Not myth, but memory, passed through the ages by those who witnessed the end of the world and lived to rebuild it. Some researchers, like marine geologist Dr. Graham Hancock, have suggested that advanced coastal cultures could have existed before this flood. Seafarers, builders, astronomers, whose knowledge was carried forward by the survivors. Mainstream science remains cautious, yet the puzzle pieces fit too neatly to ignore. As the Great Melt continued, the face of Earth was remade. Forests spread, deserts formed, and new rivers carved their paths. But among the scattered survivors, something new began to awaken: memory, myth, and the first whispers of rebuilding. Every culture, no matter how distant or divided by time, carries the same memory: a flood that erased the world, a storm that lasted for days and nights without end. A handful of survivors clinging to the remnants of an age now forgotten. Could it be that these legends, scattered across continents, are not coincidence, but echoes of a real event? In Mesopotamia, the world's oldest known story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells of a man named Utnapishtim. Warned by the gods, he built a great vessel before the flood swept across the earth. When the waters receded, his ship rested upon a mountain, and he released a dove to search for dry land. Thousands of years later, the book of Genesis would tell almost the same story: the story of Noah, the ark, and the flood that destroyed mankind. In India, ancient Sanskrit texts speak of Manu, a man saved from the deluge by a sacred fish who guided his boat to safety on a mountaintop. In China, myths describe Nuwa, the goddess who repaired the heavens after a great flood shattered the world below. Among the Maya, there is a tale of angry gods who unleashed water and fire to destroy the wooden people who had forgotten their makers. And in Australia, Aboriginal traditions recall a time when the sea swallowed the coastlines and the stars themselves changed their positions in the sky. These stories were born oceans apart, long before ships or writing connected distant lands, yet all remember the same catastrophe: the world before, the flood, and the rebirth that followed. Could so many civilizations share the same vision by accident? Or were they preserving fragments of a shared memory, passed down from those who lived through the Great Melt? Modern archaeology has shown that between 12,000 and 10,000 years before Christus, sea levels rose dramatically, drowning millions of square kilometers of land. Entire ecosystems vanished beneath the waves. To the people who lived then, it would have felt like the end of creation itself. Even Plato, writing in 360 before Christus, described Atlantis as a mighty civilization destroyed by floods and earthquakes 9,000 years before his time. That places its fall, astonishingly, near the same period as the end of the Ice Age. Coincidence or continuity? Many scholars insist these are only myths, symbols of renewal and moral cleansing. But for others, like the late oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the Titanic, flood stories might hold truth. While exploring the Black Sea, Ballard's team found evidence of a sudden and massive flood event around 5,600 before Christus, strong enough to inspire generations of memory. If such floods happened more than once, how many stories might have roots in reality far older than we think? Perhaps the flood myths were not the beginning of imagination, but the echo of the moment humanity began again. Long after the floodwaters receded, the earth kept its secrets locked in ice. For thousands of years, the frozen sheets of Greenland and Antarctica preserved a silent record of what happened, a diary written not in words, but in layers of snow and ash. And within those layers lie the clues to a catastrophe that changed the course of human history. When scientists drill deep into the polar ice, each meter they pull up is a page of time. Bubbles of ancient air trap the atmosphere of long-vanished ages. Dust and volcanic ash mark distant eruptions. Tiny shards of black carbon hint at wildfires that once burned across continents. And in a band dated to roughly 12,800 years before Christus, the record suddenly shifts. Temperatures plunge. Soot levels spike. Particles of melted glass and microscopic metallic spheres appear. Signatures of heat so intense it could have come only from the sky. To researchers such as Dr. James Kennett and Dr. Alan West, these fragments suggest that a comet or cluster of meteor fragments may have struck the northern hemisphere, setting forests alight and plunging the planet back into ice. This is the layer scientists call the Younger Dryas boundary, a thin black line separating one world from another. But the ice holds more than chemistry. It holds silence, 1,000 years of cold where human traces nearly vanish. Archaeological sites from this period are rare. Settlements disappear. Even cave art becomes sparse. It is as though humanity itself retreated into hiding, waiting for the earth to calm. Yet not everything was lost. In places spared by the glaciers, faint clues remain. Charred bone fragments in North America show that great herds of mammoth and bison were hunted, and then, suddenly, gone. At the edges of the melt zones, strange geometric carvings appear on exposed rock, symbols whose purpose we no longer understand. And deep beneath the ice of Greenland, radar mapping has revealed hidden landscapes, valleys, riverbeds, even what could be ancient lakes, buried since the world first froze. If there were once settlements here, they would be sealed beneath kilometers of ice, perfectly preserved and completely unreachable. The Earth's greatest time capsule, locked away by the very disaster that erased it. For mainstream science, these clues are pieces of a vast and complex puzzle. For those who believe a lost civilization once thrived before the flood, they are the fingerprints of that forgotten age, evidence waiting patiently for discovery. One thing is certain: the ice remembers, and as it melts again in our own century, it may yet reveal the final proof of what was lost 12,000 years before Christus. Long before recorded time, the skies above Earth burned. Around 12,800 years. Before Christus, something entered our atmosphere, something vast, fast and merciless. Some say it was a single comet fragment. Others believe it was a swarm of cosmic debris from the breakup of a giant body in space. Whatever it was, it left scars that the planet still remembers. Across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, a strange black layer appears in the soil, a line of carbon and ash that marks the boundary between two worlds, the age before and the age after. To the untrained eye, it looks like nothing, just dark earth. But under a microscope, it tells a different story. Tiny, glassy spherules formed in extreme heat, particles of melted stone, and traces of platinum far higher than normal in nature. Scientists such as Dr. James Kennett from the University of California and Dr. Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory found these clues and compared them to impact materials found at known meteor sites. The signature matched. They called it the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the theory that a cosmic explosion struck the ice sheets of North America, igniting forests, vaporizing animals, and sending shockwaves of dust into the atmosphere. Imagine the sight: a light brighter than the sun, followed by thunder that shook the ground, fire falling from the sky, melting the ice, filling the air with smoke. Within hours, whole regions burned. Within days, temperatures collapsed. Sunlight dimmed behind clouds of ash. Rain turned to snow, and summer became winter overnight. The impact would have unleashed massive floods as the melting ice poured into the oceans. Gigantic waves, hundreds of meters high, surged across the continents. If there had been coastal cities, they would have vanished in moments, erased so completely that only myth could remember them. Some scientists argue that such devastation is impossible, that the evidence is scattered, inconsistent, unproven. Others counter that the clues are too many to ignore. Charcoal layers stretching thousands of kilometers, sudden extinctions of Ice Age animals, and the abrupt cooling recorded in Greenland's ice cores. It is not the first time Earth has been struck from above. 66 million years. Before Christus, a much larger impact wiped out the dinosaurs. But this one, if it happened, changed the fate of humans. It did not destroy us. It tested us. For the scattered people of that ancient world, the sky itself became the enemy. Fire, darkness, cold, the elements of survival rewritten in a single night. When the dust finally settled, the planet was reborn into chaos. And from that chaos, humanity would rise again, different, diminished, but alive. The sky was burning. For days and nights after the impact, the air itself seemed alive with flame. Forests that had stood for 10,000 years ignited like dry grass. The heat swept across plains, mountains, and valleys, leaving behind a blackened world. This was the age when the earth burned. Across what is now North America, a thin line of charcoal still runs through ancient soil. Scientists call it the black mat, a boundary layer dating to roughly 12,800 years before Christus, marking one of the greatest wildfire events in known history. Charred pollen, melted glass, and soot particles lie trapped in that dark band, testifying to a cataclysm that scorched millions of square kilometers. When researchers analyzed this layer, they discovered something extraordinary: levels of carbon so high that they could not be explained by normal forest fires. The heat must have been unimaginable, hot enough to melt rock, vaporize water, and blanket entire continents in smoke. For weeks, the sun dimmed to a red glow. The air turned heavy with ash. Animals fled from flames that stretched to the horizon, and the very ground beneath them burned. This was not a single fire. It was thousands, ignited all at once by a wave of molten debris from the skies. Meteoric fragments struck the ice sheets and forests simultaneously, sending shockwaves of plasma through the atmosphere. Where the sparks fell, the earth caught fire. It was a global inferno. Geologists from the University of Kansas and the University of South Carolina found matching evidence across continents: black carbon layers in Europe, the Middle East, and even South America, all dating to the same period. The pattern was too precise to dismiss. Everywhere the black line appears, life suddenly vanishes from the fossil record. For the people who lived through it, the world must have looked like the end of creation. Imagine standing beneath a blood-red sky, the ground trembling, the air choking with smoke, herds stampeding in panic, the sound of trees exploding from heat. There would have been no day, no night, only firelight. And yet, even in destruction, the earth began to transform. The burning of forests released vast amounts of carbon into the air, feeding new growth in the centuries that followed. Ash enriched the soil, turning desolation into fertile ground. Out of ruin, new ecosystems were born. But for those who survived, the scars of fire became the foundation of memory. Perhaps this is why so many ancient myths speak of fire falling from heaven, of suns that darkened, of gods who punished the earth with flame. They were not imagining, they were remembering. The flames that once consumed the continents did more than end an age. They marked the beginning of a new one, a world purified by fire, awaiting the flood to come. When the fires finally began to fade, the world did not return to light. It fell into shadow. Ash drifted across the skies like a second snowfall, blotting out the sun. The planet grew quiet, and the age of darkness began. From the burned continents of North America to the steppes of Eurasia, a grey veil spread overhead. Tiny particles of soot, lifted miles high by heat and storms, formed a dense cloud that dimmed the sunlight and cooled the air. For months, maybe years, the earth shivered under its own smoke. Ice cores from Greenland preserve this silence, in layers dated to around 12,800 years. Before Christus, scientists found sudden spikes in soot, followed by a sharp drop in temperature. It was as though the planet's thermostat had been shattered. Warmth vanished almost overnight, replaced by bitter cold. This was the turning point, the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year winter that arrived in a world still reeling from fire. The oceans cooled, glaciers advanced again, and winds carried fine dust across half the planet. For those who survived, the sun became a distant memory. Imagine waking each morning to a dim grey sky. The air is cold, heavy, and dry. The forests are gone. The rivers are black with ash. Even the stars seem dull behind the haze. Nothing grows easily. The animals you once hunted are gone, and the seeds you plant refuse to sprout. Archaeologists studying this period find evidence of sudden collapse. Hunting camps disappear. Tools become cruder. Cave dwellings deepen as people seek warmth underground. It is as if humanity itself drew inward, conserving fire, memory, and hope. Yet, even in the dark, new patterns began to form. Groups gathered near rivers that still flowed. They shared stories of the sky's anger, tales of gods and serpents, of fire from above, and of the promise that one day the light would return. Those stories became the first myths, the foundations of faith itself. Modern researchers call this a bottleneck, a time when human populations shrank to a fraction of what they had been. Genetic evidence supports it. Lineages narrow, and diversity dips sharply around this era. Somewhere in the cold and ash, our ancestors endured the hardest trial in history. And then, slowly, the sky began to clear. The clouds thinned. The sun returned, pale and weak at first, but rising higher each year. Ice melted. Rivers ran free again. The planet was ready to be reborn, and so was mankind. But the memory of that darkness never left us. It lingers in ancient legends of the long night, of suns swallowed by smoke, of stars that fell and burned the world. Perhaps we remember because the earth itself remembers, in ash, in ice, and in stone. When the ice began to melt again, the world awoke to a new kind of destruction. It was not fire from the sky this time, but water from the deep. The long winter that followed the impact had locked the oceans in silence. But as the sun returned, that silence broke. Around 11,600 years. Before Christus, the frozen sheets that once covered continents started to collapse for good. Each melting glacier was a sleeping giant waking from its slumber. Rivers swelled beyond their banks. Lakes burst through their icy prisons. And slowly, relentlessly, the oceans began to rise. At first, the change was almost invisible, a few centimeters each year. But within a lifetime, shorelines vanished. Coastal plains became marshes, marshes became bays, and whole valleys disappeared beneath the waves. Scientists estimate that the oceans rose more than 120 meters as the ice melted, an entire planet reshaped by water. The sound of this transformation still echoes in the geological record. Sediment cores from the North Sea reveal layers of sand where grasslands once grew. Beneath those waters lies Doggerland, a vast land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. There, people hunted deer and built shelters of bone and reed, until one day the sea claimed it all. Similar stories unfolded around the world. In what is now Southeast Asia, the shallow plains of Sundaland vanished under rising tides. scattering early peoples across the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. To the east, the flooded basin of Beringia, once a bridge between Asia and America, was swallowed whole, and along the coasts of the Mediterranean, submerged ruins hint at settlements that stood long before the first written word. For those who lived through it, the change must have felt like the end of creation itself. Imagine generations watching the sea climb higher each year, claiming the graves of their ancestors and the stones of their homes. The horizon moved closer. The world grew smaller, and with each wave, memory slipped further away. In ancient myth, this memory became the story of divine punishment, the flood of Noah, the drowning of Atlantis, the cleansing waters of forgotten gods. But perhaps these were not moral tales at all. Perhaps they were records, the only way for survivors to preserve what truly happened. Modern researchers, such as marine geologist Dr. Robert Ballard, have discovered evidence of sudden, catastrophic flooding in the Black Sea, salt water rushing in from the Mediterranean around 600. Before Christus, drowning villages in a matter of months. If smaller floods could reshape regions, imagine what global sea level rise could do. Where ancient coasts once stood, only the ocean now keeps watch. Beneath it may lie the ruins of an age we have forgotten, temples, walls, and cities built by those who lived before the flood. We have only begun to search. When the oceans rose and the fires faded, the world was supposed to heal. But instead, the earth grew cold once more. The great melt had unleashed chaos. Vast rivers of fresh water pouring into the seas, cooling the currents that carried warmth across the planet. And so, the long winter descended again. It began quietly, around 10,900 years before Christus. The air lost its softness, snow returned to the mountains, and the ice, which had retreated for centuries, crept forward once more. In Greenland's ice cores, this shift is sudden, almost vertical, a plunge of more than 10 degrees in global temperature within a single human lifetime. Scientists call it the final breath of the Younger Dryas, the last cold heartbeat of the Ice Age. For the people who lived through it, the world must have felt cursed. The lands that had only just thawed froze again. Hunting grounds disappeared beneath snow. The rivers they had relied upon turned to ice, trapping fish and silencing the sound of running water. Firewood became precious, shelter essential. Many tribes moved south, chasing warmth that kept retreating like a ghost before them. The animals of the Old World were not so lucky. The mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed cat, all vanished within a few centuries. Their bones lie scattered across tundra and steppe, buried beneath the cold dust of time. To those who survived, these extinctions would have felt like the breaking of the natural order. The great beasts were gone, and with them, a way of life. Yet even in this frozen silence, humanity endured. Firelight flickered in caves and rock shelters. Stone tools became sharper, more refined. And somewhere in Anatolia, in what would one day be called Göbekli Tepe, people began to build again. Massive stones were raised toward the sky, not for shelter, but for meaning. Perhaps these were memorials to the world that had been lost. or prayers for warmth to return. Modern climatologists believe the long winter ended as abruptly as it began, around 9,600 years. Before Christus, temperatures spiked again, and the Ice Age was gone forever. The Earth shifted into the stable, warm climate that we still enjoy today. But for the survivors of that final freeze, the scars remained, not just in the land, but in memory. They remembered the fire that fell from heaven, the floods that drowned their homes, the endless snow that followed. Those memories became the foundation of every creation story ever told. Tales of endings and new beginnings, of gods who destroyed and remade the world. And when the ice finally retreated for the last time, humankind stepped into a new dawn. The age of forgotten catastrophe was over. The age of rebuilding had begun. When the long winter came, not everyone perished. Scattered across the world were small bands of survivors, families, clans, and wanderers who refused to surrender to the cold. They were not kings or engineers. They had no temples or cities, but they carried something far greater, the memory of what had been lost. It was around 10,500 years before Christus, the final stretch of the Ice Age. The planet was frozen, but pockets of life remained. Along the edges of the glaciers, near rivers that still flowed, people built shelters of bone, hide, and stone. They hunted what little game remained, reindeer, elk, wild horses, and fished through holes in the ice. Every day was a test, every night a story told to keep hope alive. Archaeologists have found traces of these survivors across the world. Stone hearths buried beneath permafrost in Siberia, flint tools along the Danube, and charred bones deep in caves of southern France and Spain. Each discovery whispers of adaptation, of endurance against odds that should have erased them. They learned to make fire in storms, to weave clothing from frozen grass, to carve needles from ivory. In the silence of the snow, humanity sharpened both its tools and its mind. But what truly kept them alive was not strength alone. It was memory. Around the fires, they spoke of a time when the world was warmer, when great beasts roamed the plains and the sea was far away. They spoke of the fire in the sky, the flood that followed, and the years of darkness. Parents told their children, who told theirs in turn. Over generations, these stories became legend, then myth. The great catastrophe slowly transformed into tales of gods and punishment, of floods and rebirth. Modern researchers studying early genetics suggest that many of today's populations descend from a few small Ice Age groups that survived in these refuges. One lineage sheltered in the highlands of Anatolia, another along the Nile Valley, and others on the Indian subcontinent. When the ice finally withdrew, these groups emerged into the open world, a world reborn, empty, waiting. They brought with them their stories, their tools, and faint echoes of knowledge that predated the disaster. It is tempting to imagine that among them were the children of those who once lived in the lost coastal lands, carrying memories of their drowned homes, of the stars they used for travel, of the craft that once built wonders now buried by the sea. Perhaps that is why, when warmth returned, they began to build again, as if guided by a memory they could no longer fully explain. These were the people who endured the cold, not by conquering it, but by remembering who they were. And when the first green shoots appeared once more on the tundra, humanity was ready to rise from the ashes of ice. When the ice began to retreat for the final time, the world did not return to the way it was. It was raw, restless, and wild, a place caught between winter and spring. Vast rivers of meltwater cut through the earth, carving new valleys and feeding endless grasslands. Across these shifting plains, the survivors of the long cold began to move. They were hunters, travelers, and dreamers, the first to walk in the world reborn. It was around 10,000 years before Christus, and the planet was thawing fast. Gigantic lakes formed where ice once stood. Lake Agassiz in North America, Lake Missoula in the west, and countless others across Eurasia. These were not calm waters. When the ice dams broke, entire regions flooded overnight. Rivers shifted, continents reshaped. Yet, in the spaces between destruction, life returned. The hunters followed it. They moved with the herds, reindeer, aurochs, and wild horses, across the green corridors that opened beneath the melting skies. With each generation, they learned the rhythms of the new world. They built traps from stone, shaped weapons from flint and bone, and read the stars to find their way across the endless horizon. Archaeological sites from this time tell a story of ingenuity and adaptation. In the plains of Europe, the Magdalenian and Arensberg cultures left behind bone harpoons, delicate carvings, and spear points designed for precision. In Siberia, people crafted shelters from mammoth bones and learned to store meat in frozen ground. And in what is now Turkey, small groups began to settle seasonally near fertile rivers, the first quiet steps toward farming. But these hunters were more than survivors. They were witnesses. They carried the stories of the old world, the fires, the floods, the long night of ice, and they retold them beneath the stars of a new age. Their oral traditions became maps of memory, preserving the knowledge of landscapes that no longer existed. When they looked to the horizon, they did not see wilderness. They saw the ghosts of drowned lands, the edges of a world their ancestors once knew. Modern genetic studies trace their movements through the DNA of their descendants. As the ice withdrew, these peoples spread outward into Europe, the Middle East, and eventually across Asia and the Americas. Each migration carried fragments of ancient knowledge, the art of stone shaping, the secrets of the hunt, and perhaps even whispers of navigation across the sea. In this way, the hunters of the meltwater plains became the bridge between worlds, the last heirs of the lost age, and the founders of the one to come. Through them, humanity not only survived, but began to shape the earth anew. When the hunters of the meltwater plains stopped to rest, they found shelter in the oldest places of all, the caves. Deep within mountains and river valleys, they lit fires that pushed back the darkness and painted the stone walls with memory. It was there, beneath rock older than time, that humanity began to remember itself. It was around 9,500 years before Christus, and the earth was warming again. The glaciers retreated north, revealing valleys rich with game and rivers full of fish. Yet danger still ruled the open plains. Sudden storms, floods, and the endless movement of the herds The caves offered protection, warmth, and something else: silence. A space where thought could echo. In southern France, at places like Chauvet and Lascaux, explorers have found layers of soot that show generations of fires, the breath of countless winters. Above those layers, painted in ochre and black, are visions of animals long extinct: mammoth, bison, lion. They are not mere drawings. They are messages, symbols of reverence, records of a vanished world. Archaeologists believe these images were more than art. They were memory encoded in symbol. Each figure told a story, each pattern a reminder. When spoken aloud beside the firelight, they became ritual, a way to preserve what the people of the Ice Age feared most: forgetting. Across Eurasia, from Spain to Siberia, the same instinct appeared. In caves like Altamira, Kapova, and Creswell Crags, the walls carried dreams of fire and flood. It was as if every tribe felt the same need: to mark the stone, to leave proof that they had lived through the darkness. Anthropologists studying early human behavior note that this period marks a profound shift in consciousness. People were no longer only surviving, they were recording, teaching, planning. Beside each hearth lay tools not just for hunting, but for shaping and counting: bone flutes, tally marks, and primitive calendars cut into stone. They tracked the stars and the seasons, waiting for warmth to return in rhythm with the sky. Perhaps in those caves, among whispers of flame and smoke, the last memories of the lost civilization were spoken aloud for the final time. Stories of coasts swallowed by the sea, of towers broken by fire from the heavens. Those words, repeated over generations, may have become the myths we still tell today. And as centuries passed, the people emerged once more into sunlight. The caves grew cold, their fires dimmed, but on the stone walls the knowledge remained, frozen in colour and line, untouched by time. They had carried the past through the storm, and now they were ready to build again. When the ice finally loosened its grip, and the rivers began to sing again, humanity stepped into a new dawn. The earth was scarred but alive, and so were the people who had endured it. They no longer wandered aimlessly across frozen plains. They began to settle, to shape the land, and to rebuild what the flood had taken. It was around 9,700 years before Christus, a time historians now call the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture, community, and memory made permanent. Where once there had been hunters and gatherers, there were now builders and planters. They learned to tame the wild grasses that grew in the fertile valleys, saving the seeds and sowing them again with each season. They built pens for animals, carved channels for water, and raised the first walls of clay and stone. In the hills of southern Anatolia, near the rising rivers of the Fertile Crescent, a settlement called Göbekli Tepe emerged. There, people who still had no pottery, no writing, and no metal tools gathered to raise colossal pillars from the earth, some weighing more than 20 tons. Each stone was carved with images of foxes, lions, and serpents. They formed circles that faced the stars, aligned with the heavens as if the builders were trying to remember the patterns of a world long gone. Archaeologists call Göbekli Tepe the oldest known temple complex on Earth, built nearly 7,000 years before the pyramids. Yet even today, no one knows why it was created, or why its makers later buried it beneath tons of soil, as if to protect it from something. To many researchers, it marks the first clear sign of organized spiritual life after the Great Catastrophe, a symbol that humanity had begun to rebuild, not just its homes, but its soul. Elsewhere, similar sparks appeared. In Jericho, people built circular towers of stone to guard against floods. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, clay bricks dried beneath the sun, forming the walls of the first permanent villages. And along the banks of the Nile and Indus, small farming communities took root, tracing irrigation lines that mirrored the paths of ancient rivers now lost beneath the sand. This rebuilding was not simply practical, it was remembrance. Every wall raised, every seed planted, was an act of defiance against oblivion. The survivors of the flood and the long winter were telling the earth, "We are still here." They carried fragments of forgotten knowledge, the way stars moved, how stone could stand against time, how the seasons returned in rhythm with the sun. And from these fragments, the foundation of civilization was born anew. Long before writing, long before stone tablets or papyrus scrolls, the only way to remember was to speak. Every story was a thread in the fabric of survival, a way to pass knowledge through generations without ever putting it to paper. And among those early people who rebuilt the world after the flood, stories became something sacred. They were not just tales. They were warnings, maps, and memories. By 9,000 years before Christus, small communities had begun to form across the warming world, in the river valleys of the Middle East, the grasslands of Africa, and the coasts of the Mediterranean. Each group carried with it stories of the past, told beside fires, under stars, and within the walls of the first temples. They spoke of fire from the heavens, of waters that rose to swallow the land, and of gods who remade the world from dust. To them, these were not myths. They were the truth of their ancestors, the memory of an age no one was allowed to forget. In Sumer, one of the world's first civilizations, scribes would one day carve these memories into clay. They told of a time when the great gods decided to send a flood, and of one man who built a vessel to save the seeds of life. His name was Ziusudra, and his tale would later become the Epic of Gilgamesh, and still later, the story of Noah in the Hebrew texts. Far to the east, the same story lived in the Mahabharata of India, where the sage Manu was warned by a divine fish to build a boat before the waters came. And across the ocean, the Maya spoke of gods who destroyed the wooden people with floods and fire when they lost respect for creation. Even the Aboriginal Australians, separated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, tell of the rising seas that swallowed their coastal hunting grounds. How could so many peoples, divided by distance and time, remember the same event? Could it be that these stories all came from a shared origin, the flood that ended the Ice Age and erased a civilization 12,000 years before Christus? For generations, scholars dismissed these tales as coincidence or metaphor. But oral traditions are not random. They evolve slowly, preserving core truths even as details change. And the further researchers trace these myths, the clearer their pattern becomes. A pattern of loss, survival, and rebirth. The first myths were not fantasy. They were the world's earliest form of history. Knowledge carried, not in books, but in breath, and through them, fragments of the forgotten age survived. So, as the people of the New Dawn built their homes, they also built their stories, the foundation of every civilization that would follow. Memory had endured the ice, the fire, and the flood, and now, through myth, it would never die. High in the dry hills of southeastern Anatolia, where the land folds into sun-bleached ridges, lies a mound that was once thought to be nothing more than earth and dust. Its name in Turkish means potbelly hill, Göbekli Tepe, but beneath that modest surface sleeps one of the most astonishing discoveries in human history. It was around 9,500 years before Christus when people first came here. They were still hunters and gatherers, without pottery or metal, yet somehow they built a monument that would not be matched for millennia. Massive pillars of limestone, some weighing 20 tons, were carved, shaped, and lifted into circles that faced the rising stars. The stones were smooth and deliberate, etched with animals, lions, snakes, vultures, and foxes, frozen in perfect motion. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt uncovered the first pillars in the 1990s, he realized instantly that this was no ordinary sight. The carbon dating stunned the world. Göbekli Tepe was 6,000 years older than the pyramids of Giza, older even than Stonehenge. It rewrote the timeline of civilization itself. Until that moment, scholars believed temples came after cities, that only organized societies could produce monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe proved the opposite. It was belief, not agriculture, that first brought people together. The builders gathered from distant valleys, perhaps drawn by memory, perhaps by purpose, to create a place where the heavens met the earth. What drove them to carve these stones with such devotion? Some think it was a shrine to the dead, others a map of the stars. The site's alignment with the constellation Orion suggests that its creators watched the sky carefully, perhaps marking the end of the long winter and the return of warmth. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe may have been a monument to survival itself, a message from the first generation born after the Great Flood and the Long Cold. Even stranger, centuries later, the people who built it buried it completely. Stone by stone, they covered the circles with earth, hiding them from the world. No one knows why. Was it to protect the site from invaders? To honor the gods who no longer answered? Or was it a ritual farewell, a symbolic closing of the age of memory? For more than 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe slept beneath the dust, its builders forgotten. Yet their hands left marks that endure, finger grooves in the limestone, still visible today, as if waiting for us to find them again. Standing on that hill now, looking out across the endless Anatolian plain, it is easy to imagine them, the descendants of the flood, shaping stone by torchlight, whispering stories of the world before the waters came. They carved not to worship, but to remember. Long after Göbekli Tepe was buried beneath the Anatolian dust, others across the world began to lift stones of their own. It was as if the memory of sacred geometry, the circle, had travelled silently through time. carried by descendants of the flood. From the plains of Mesopotamia to the green hills of Europe, the same pattern appeared, rings of stone pointing toward the heavens. It was around 8,000 years before Christus when these circles began to rise. At first, they were small, a few stones marking the sun's passage across the horizon. But with each generation, they grew larger, more precise, more deliberate. The builders aligned them with the solstices, with the stars, and with forces of nature they could feel but not yet explain. In Scotland, the Callanish stones still stand, massive slabs of gneiss arranged in a cross within a circle, older than the pyramids, older even than written history. Farther south, in Malta, ancient temples like Menajra and Hagar Chim curve in perfect harmony with the sun's rising arc. At dawn on the spring equinox, sunlight passes directly through their stone doorways, illuminating carvings worn smooth by thousands of years of wind and salt. Archaeologists often describe these sites as primitive observatories, but perhaps they were something more, not instruments of measurement, but monuments of remembrance. Their builders were not merely tracking time, they were honoring the cycle that had once nearly destroyed them. Each rising sun was proof that the dark age of ice and flood was over. Even in Britain, the tradition continued. Long before Stonehenge took its famous form, smaller circles dotted the countryside, markers of gathering, celebration, and ceremony. The precision of their placement still puzzles researchers today. Without metal tools or the wheel, how did ancient people move stones weighing dozens of tons, some dragged from quarries more than 20 kilometers away? Perhaps the answer lies not in lost technology, but in unity. To raise a circle of stone required hundreds of hands, guided by shared purpose, and perhaps by shared memory. The people of this new world were no longer mere survivors. They were architects of meaning, binding earth and sky in patterns older than writing. Some researchers, like archaeologist Dr. Michael Parker Pearson, have noted that many of these circles form a symbolic bridge between life and death, places where the living could speak to the ancestors, where the sun's return each year mirrored the promise of rebirth. If so, the circles may not only map the heavens, they may also mark humanity's first attempts to understand its own mortality. Standing among these stones today, it is easy to feel their silence. They lean, they weather, but they endure, timeless witnesses to a story we are still remembering. Each one whispers the same message the builders of Göbekli Tepe left behind. The past is not gone. It sleeps beneath the surface, waiting to be found. For centuries, the ocean has hidden its secrets well, but every so often, the sea gives something back, a whisper of stone beneath the waves, a shape that does not belong to nature. There, under the weight of time and tide, lie the ghosts of a forgotten world. Ruins that should not exist. Structures that may have stood long before any known civilization. It was around 9,000 years. Before Christus, when the rising oceans swallowed vast stretches of land. Valleys became bays, mountains became islands, and entire coastlines vanished beneath the deep. If a civilization had lived along those shores, the flood erased all trace of it, or so we thought. In Japan, off the southern island of Yonaguni, divers in the 1980s discovered a massive underwater formation of terraces, pillars, and steps cut with eerie precision. Known today as the Yonaguni Monument, it descends more than 25 meters below the surface. The stones are sharp-edged, layered like a pyramid, and aligned with the compass points. Some believe it is a natural formation shaped by tectonic movement, but others see the work of human hands, buried by the sea around 10,000 years, before Christus, when the floodwaters first rose. Far across the globe, in the Gulf of Campat, off India's western coast, sonar scans revealed an even larger mystery, a series of symmetrical structures stretching for kilometers beneath the murky water. Marine archaeologist Dr. S.R. Rao, who also excavated the ancient city of Dwaraka, reported pottery fragments and carbon samples suggesting human habitation dating back more than 9,000 years. Before Christus, centuries before the earliest known Indian civilization. Even in the Mediterranean, whispers of lost coasts persist. Off the shores of Malta, divers have found megalithic blocks similar to those of the island's above-ground temples, lying deep below the modern seabed. And near the Bahamas, the so-called Bimini Road, a pathway of massive limestone slabs, has stirred debate for decades. Coincidence or remnants of a drowned city? No one can say for certain. The ocean floor keeps its silence. Currents bury ruins beneath layers of sand, coral, and sediment. What we glimpse are fragments, a corner, a staircase, a wall, as though the sea allows us only partial memories of what once stood there. For mainstream archaeology, such discoveries demand caution. Many of these formations may indeed be natural, sculpted by time and water, but to others, they are the scattered fingerprints of a civilization erased 12,000 years before Christus, one that lived and died before the written word, leaving behind only stone and myth. And perhaps that is fitting, because if the story of humanity began not with clay tablets or cities on dry land, but with structures that now lie beneath the sea, then the greatest library of human history may still be waiting, silent, dark, and untouched, beneath the waves. Long before satellites traced the contours of our planet, before ships crossed the open oceans, ancient maps hinted at something extraordinary. Coastlines that should not have been known, drawn thousands of years before explorers ever sailed them. They are the maps that defy time. Maps that remember a world which may have existed long before history began. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, discovered in Istanbul in 1929. Drawn on gazelle skin by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, it shows parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with startling accuracy. But the greatest mystery lies at its southern edge, a section of coastline that appears to depict Antarctica. Not as it is today, buried beneath ice, but as it would look ice-free. The admiral himself claimed he copied his map from ancient sources. Some said to date back to the time of Alexander the Great. Modern cartographers who examined it noted something impossible. The subglacial features of Antarctica shown on the map match what we now know from seismic surveys. Terrain no human could have seen for at least 6,000 years. If this is true, who mapped it, and when? The Oronteus Phineus map, drawn in 1531, repeats the same mystery. It shows Antarctica with rivers, mountains, and a clear central plateau. Details that align uncannily with modern topography beneath the ice sheet. Mainstream historians argue that such accuracy could only be coincidence, but even coincidence struggles to explain the precision of latitude and longitude lines centuries before their invention. Then there is the Bouache map, drawn in the 18th century, showing Antarctica divided into two landmasses, separated by a water channel, a feature later confirmed by sonar imaging beneath the continent's ice. Its creator claimed to have based it on ancient records, preserved in the archives of early civilizations. Taken together, these maps form a puzzle, fragments of a global memory that does not fit into accepted history. Could they be echoes of an earlier civilization, one capable of mapping the Earth long before the rise of Sumer or Egypt? If so, they may represent the last surviving traces of a lost seafaring culture, one that charted the planet's coastlines before the Great Flood, when sea levels were lower and Antarctica still free of ice. Skeptics insist these coincidences can be explained by artistic guesswork and ancient imagination. But the mystery remains. How did cartographers from the Renaissance era obtain knowledge of lands hidden beneath ice for millennia? Perhaps the answer lies not in the mapmakers themselves, but in the unseen hands who came before. Navigators who measured the stars, who knew the shape of the world when it was still young. Their maps may not have survived in stone, metal, but their knowledge endured, carried through myth, trade, and oral memory, like faint light from a vanished age, guiding us still. Long before telescopes or compasses, ancient people watched the sky as though it were a living clock. The stars were their calendar, their compass, and their history book. But what if the constellations also carried something else? A secret connection between heaven and earth, a pattern preserved by civilizations long before our own. Around 9,000 years before Christus, as the ice melted and the New World emerged, humans began to build structures that reached for the stars. From the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia to the megalithic temples of Malta, each monument seemed to follow an invisible design, one written not on the land, but in the sky. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists noticed that many of its stone circles align with celestial events, the rising of the bright star Sirius, and the path of the constellation Orion, long associated with rebirth and the afterlife. Carvings of animals on the pillars may represent star clusters, the vulture, the scorpion, the fox, constellations as they appeared nearly 12,000 years ago. It is as if the builders were recording the heavens at the exact moment the world they once knew was ending. This same pattern appears again across the planet. In Egypt, the three Great Pyramids of Giza mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, perfectly aligned along the Milky Way. In Peru, the ancient city of Cusco was built in the shape of a puma, its sacred sites marking points of celestial importance. And in Cambodia, the vast layout of Angkor Wat follows the same stellar alignment, the movement of Venus, the morning star. How could cultures separated by oceans and millennia have shared the same fascination, the same precision? Some believe it is coincidence. Others see it as evidence of a shared inheritance, a legacy of star knowledge passed down from a forgotten civilization that mapped the heavens before the flood. When the oceans rose and the world changed, their descendants may have scattered, carrying fragments of astronomical memory to every corner of the Earth. Modern researchers, like engineer Robert Bauval, have demonstrated that the Orion alignment at Giza matches the sky as it appeared around 10,100 years before Christus, thousands of years before Egypt's accepted history begins. If true, this could mean that the pyramid builders were honoring a celestial memory far older than their own civilization. Everywhere we look, stone and star seem to speak to one another, from Britain's Stonehenge to Mexico's Teotihuacan, from Easter Island's silent statues to the desert lines of Nazca. These alignments were not random. They were messages, reminders that we come from a world that once read the sky not for wonder, but for survival. Perhaps those early builders understood something we have forgotten, that the story of Earth is written in two places, on the ground beneath our feet and in the stars above our heads. When the first great monuments of the New World rose from the dust, they carried with them a strange familiarity, as if the people who built them were not inventing something new, but remembering something old. From Anatolia to Egypt, from Peru to the Indus Valley, the same patterns appeared again and again. Precise stonework, perfect geometry, and an understanding of balance and movement that seemed far beyond their time. How could people who still lived close to the earth, farmers, hunters, herders, have known how to cut and lift stones weighing hundreds of tons? How did they align vast structures with the stars and with the turning of the earth itself? Archaeology calls these questions puzzles. But perhaps they are not puzzles at all. Perhaps they are echoes. It was around 9,000 to 7,000 years before Christus when humanity began to rebuild in earnest. In Egypt, the early settlers of the Nile learned to quarry limestone with precision, shaping blocks so smooth they could fit together without mortar. In Mesopotamia, builders used baked clay to construct ziggurats that rose in stepped layers toward the heavens. And in Peru, the ancestors of the Andean cultures mastered the art of fitting polygonal stones together so tightly that even a blade of grass could not pass between them. Everywhere, the same principle: permanence through perfection. The knowledge did not seem to spread outward. It seemed to reappear, as if drawn from a shared memory that reached far deeper than any known civilization. In 1994, researchers analyzing the layout of Sacsayhuaman in Peru noticed that its zigzag walls mirrored patterns of energy flow found in natural fault lines. In Egypt, the internal design of the Great Pyramid displayed mathematical constants, P and the golden ratio, embedded with uncanny accuracy. In India's ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, drainage systems and street grids predate most known urban planning by millennia. Coincidence or remembrance? Some researchers believe that the survivors of the pre-flood world may have carried fragments of lost engineering knowledge, simple, enduring principles of geometry, balance, and sound that could be replicated with the simplest of tools. Over time, these fragments became ritual, then religion. People no longer remembered why they built as they did, only that they must. Even myths echo this idea. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus, who gave fire, the spark of technology, back to humankind after a great punishment from the gods. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl descended from the heavens to teach people the arts of building, farming, and astronomy after a flood had cleansed the world. Different lands, different names, but the same story. Knowledge returning from somewhere beyond memory. Perhaps technology, like myth, never truly dies. It sleeps, waiting for the hands brave enough to awaken it again. And every stone lifted in those ancient days may have been not invention, but remembrance, a message carved in rock that whispered, "We were here before, and we knew how to build." As the first cities took shape, their builders looked not only to the ground, but to the stars. Every wall, every temple, every road seemed guided by a higher geometry, as if the sky itself were the blueprint. These were the builders who knew the heavens, men and women who carried within them the memory of celestial order. It was around 8,500 years before Christus, when the skies were still strange and bright with unfamiliar constellations. In the darkness above Mesopotamia, priests and observers mapped the motion of the heavens. They noticed that the stars rose and set in perfect rhythm, marking the turning of the seasons. They carved this rhythm into stone, transforming night into architecture. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple of humankind, pillars mark not only the rising of the sun, but also the appearance of Sirius, the brightest star, a symbol of rebirth. In Egypt, the alignment of temples along the Nile mirrors the path of Orion. Every year, when Orion returned to the night sky, the river would rise, bringing the floods that nourished the land. Coincidence, perhaps, or remembrance of an ancient tradition, one that tied human survival to the heavens. In Sumer, the world's first written records speak of gods descending from the sky, carrying knowledge of numbers, time, and measure. The ziggurats of Ur and Eridu rose tier by tier, each platform representing a planet in the heavens. Climb to the top, and you were closer to the divine order of the cosmos. Across the world, in the Andes, the same pattern appeared. The builders of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku carved stones with microscopic precision, aligning gateways with the solstices. When the morning sun shone through the central arch on the shortest day of the year, it marked the rebirth of light, the same celestial message that echoed in Egypt and Anatolia. How did people separated by oceans share the same obsession with the sky? Modern astronomers suggest that after the Great Flood, the stars themselves change position due to the tilt of Earth's axis, a phenomenon known as precession. To the survivors, this would have looked like the heavens shifting, the very order of creation rewriting itself. Perhaps they built these temples to record the change, to fix in stone what the sky refused to hold still. In later centuries, Greek philosophers would call this harmony between earth and sky cosmos, meaning order. But long before the Greeks, the builders of the new dawn already understood it. They read the stars not for myth alone, but for guidance. They measured, aligned, and remembered, because they had seen what happens when the world forgets. Every sunrise that struck their stones was a message. The heavens can fall, the seas can rise, but knowledge endures. And as long as we look upward, we will never again be lost in the dark. In every ancient ruin, there are questions carved into the stone itself, questions that science has not yet answered. How were these blocks lifted, shaped, and fitted so perfectly without metal machines or modern tools? How were they cut as if by lasers, polished to mirror-like smoothness, and transported across mountains and deserts? These mysteries are not legends. They are measurements, exact, undeniable, and waiting for explanation. It was around 8,000 years before Christus, when stoneworking reached a level of precision that still defies our understanding. At Pumapunku, high in the Bolivian Andes, massive andesite blocks lie scattered like the remnants of an exploded machine. Each stone is shaped with perfect 90-degree angles, interlocking joints, and drilled holes, yet there are no signs of chiseling, no rough edges, no errors. Some blocks weigh more than 100 tons. To this day, no one knows how they were cut or moved. In Egypt, the quarries of Aswan reveal similar marvels. The unfinished obelisk of Hatshepsut, still lying embedded in rock, shows how a single crack could halt months of labor. But what tools carved it? Bronze chisels, the only known metal of the time, could never have shaped granite with such precision. Even modern engineers admit that replicating these cuts today would require diamond-tipped drills and high-speed saws. And then there is the Great Pyramid of Giza, 2.3 million blocks of stone, each placed with such accuracy that their alignment deviates from true north by less than 1/15 of a degree. Its base is level to within a fraction of an inch, over an area the size of 5 football fields. It is as if its builders possessed a mastery of geometry and engineering that appeared fully formed, with no trace of development before or after. How could so many ancient cultures, separated by continents, share such similar techniques? The stone walls of Cusco, the temples of Malta, the terraces of Baalbek, and the pyramids of Mesoamerica all show the same features: precision, durability, and inexplicable symmetry. Some scholars propose lost methods, forgotten technologies involving sound, vibration, or the controlled use of water pressure. Ancient texts hint at this possibility. The Egyptians spoke of words of power that could move heavy objects, and Greek legends tell of Archytas of Tarentum, who built machines that flew using hidden forces of air. Were these metaphors or memories of principles we have yet to rediscover? Mainstream science urges caution, reminding us that even with simple tools, human ingenuity can achieve the extraordinary. And perhaps that is true. But perhaps, too, there was more, an inherited wisdom passed down from the world before the flood that allowed our ancestors to work stone as if it were clay. Every ancient monument still standing is more than a mystery of construction. It is a message carved in silence, proof that someone, long ago, understood the laws of nature in ways we are only beginning to remember. If you look closely at the world's oldest monuments, you begin to see a pattern, symbols repeating across continents, carved by people who never met, yet somehow spoke the same silent language. Circles, spirals, serpents, suns. Patterns that appear in temples, tombs, and megaliths from Anatolia to the Andes. It is as though the builders of the ancient world were not just shaping stone, they were writing messages for the future. At Göbekli Tepe, carved 12,000 years. Before Christus, the pillars are covered in images of animals and celestial signs: foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes. Each creature seems to represent not a myth, but a constellation. Some archaeologists, such as Dr. Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh, have suggested that the carvings encode the position of stars as they appeared during a cataclysmic event, perhaps the impact that ended the Ice Age itself. If true, Göbekli Tepe may not only be a temple, but the world's first archive, a message in stone warning future generations of what the sky once unleashed. The same symbolic code appears again and again throughout history. In Egypt, the Ankh, the cross with a loop, represents life, but also resembles the path of the sun across the sky. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent, known as Quetzalcoatl, winds across temple walls as both god and symbol of cosmic cycles. And in the Celtic world, spirals carved into stone mark the endless movement of creation and rebirth. These are not coincidences of imagination. They are memories, repeated until their meanings were forgotten, but their shapes endured. When words and alphabets did not yet exist, symbol was language, universal, unbroken, and eternal. Mathematicians studying the geometry of ancient sites have found that many follow ratios embedded in nature itself: the golden ratio, F, and the pi relationship between circle and line. These constants appear in the Great Pyramid, in Stonehenge, in temples of India and Greece. How could such knowledge have spread to every corner of the world thousands of years before formal mathematics? Perhaps it never spread at all. Perhaps it was remembered, carried through myth, song, and design by those who still recalled the order of the lost world before the flood. Symbols became bridges between memory and meaning. They transformed survival into story, and story into structure. The builders encoded more than belief. They encoded truth, the rhythm of the stars, the geometry of creation, the pattern of life repeating itself after destruction. When we stand before these ancient carvings today, we are reading the oldest book ever written, one without words, printed in stone, meant to outlast fire, water, and time itself. A language that speaks not to the mind, but to the memory buried within every one of us. When the great ice sheets were gone and the floodwaters finally stilled, humanity stood at the edge of a new beginning. But even as the world warmed and greened again, something deeper stirred, the memory of what came before. Those memories became the foundation stones of the first true civilizations. It was around 7,000 years before Christus when scattered tribes began to gather along the rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus. They came together not by chance, but by necessity, drawn to fertile floodplains that echoed the life-giving waters they once feared. And wherever they built, traces of ancient knowledge began to reappear. In Mesopotamia, the people of Sumer spoke of gods who descended from the heavens and gave them writing, mathematics, and the calendar. They built ziggurats, stairways of earth and stone, rising toward the stars, just as the builders of Göbekli Tepe once had. Their texts described cycles of time that stretched back tens of thousands of years, as though remembering eras lost to the flood. Along the Nile, Egypt began to bloom. Its earliest kings claimed descent from divine ancestors who came from the sea and taught them how to measure the heavens and harness the river. The pyramid texts, carved centuries later, still whisper of a first time, an age when the gods walked among men and knowledge flowed freely. Archaeologists can trace the art, architecture, and mathematics of Egypt straight back to that mysterious inheritance. Far to the east, in the valleys of the Indus River, the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro built cities of perfect symmetry, streets aligned to the cardinal directions, drainage systems more advanced than many that came after. Their writing remains undeciphered, as if the message it carried was never meant for us, but for those who remembered the older world. And across the ocean, in the Andes and Mesoamerica, the same signs appeared again. Pyramids rising toward the stars, calendars tuned to cosmic rhythms, myths of gods who survived a flood and brought light back to humankind. Everywhere, the pattern repeats. Different faces, different names, one legacy. A hidden thread connecting the civilizations that appeared as if from nowhere, complete, complex, and already wise. Perhaps they were not born from ignorance at all. Perhaps they were rekindlings, the return of a fire nearly extinguished 12,000 years before Christus. A spark carried through time by survivors who refused to forget. And so the world began anew. The lost knowledge of the forgotten age did not vanish. It transformed. It became law, religion, architecture, and art. It became the heartbeat of human civilization itself. By the time the first great cities rose from the river valleys, the memories of the flood were already fading. The people still spoke of them, but the stories had changed. What had once been history became legend. What had once been warning became worship. And so began the long age when memory turned into myth. It was around 6,000 years before Christus. The survivors of the forgotten world were long gone, yet their descendants still built in their image. They no longer remembered the true purpose of the stone circles or the star temples. They remembered only that the gods had taught their ancestors to build them. And in forgetting the people, they created the divine. In Sumer, scribes etched stories of the sky gods, Anu, Enki, and Enlil, beings of immense wisdom who shaped the world and brought the gift of civilization. But hidden within those tales was a deeper rhythm. Floods, fires, the destruction of worlds before our own. The same pattern reappeared in Egypt, where the priests spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, an era when the gods walked on earth and rebuilt the world after a great catastrophe. Even the Maya remembered 4 previous creations, each destroyed by water, wind, or flame before the present age. To later generations, these stories were not recollections. They were religion. But in truth, they may have been the last surviving echoes of real events, passed from tongue to tongue until their origins blurred. A flood became divine wrath. A comet became a serpent in the sky. A survivor became a god. Archaeologists call this process mythologization, when factual memory erodes and transforms into sacred story. But perhaps the ancients were not simply inventing, they were preserving truth in the only form time would allow. A myth can outlive an empire. A tale told to a child can carry knowledge farther than stone or ink. Even the numbers tell their own story. Many ancient calendars begin their count not at the founding of their civilization, but far earlier, 10,500 years. Before Christus, the very era of the Great Melt and the possible impact that reshaped the Earth. Coincidence? Or did the ancients mark the date when their world was reborn? As the millennia passed, temples replaced memories. The builders forgot the survivors. The priests forgot the builders. The gods remained, carved in stone, written in scripture, immortalized in myth. But within every story, a fragment of truth endured, waiting for a time when humanity would once again look backward and listen. We remember myths because they speak to something older than logic, the quiet instinct that we have lived this story before, that the rise and fall of worlds is not new, only repeated, and somewhere, beneath all our progress, the memory of that first lost civilization still whispers to us, do not forget what happened when the world was young. Wherever humans settled after the Great Melt, the same story followed them. Across continents and generations, through languages that would never meet, each people told of a time when the world drowned. It is the oldest shared memory on Earth, the story of the flood. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets older than the pyramids describe it first. The gods, angered by noise and pride, sent torrents from the heavens. Only Utnapishtim, warned in a dream, built a vessel to save his family and the seeds of life. When the waters fell silent, his boat came to rest upon a mountain, and he released a dove to find dry land. Thousands of years later, the same image would sail through the book of Genesis, the Ark of Noah, the mountain of Ararat, the rainbow promise. In India, the Satapatha Brahmana tells of Manu, who was saved by a talking fish that pulled his ship to the peaks of the Himalayas. In China, Nuwa, the mother goddess, melted stones to repair the sky after a cosmic flood shattered the world below. Among the Maya, the gods destroyed the wooden people with rain and fire, leaving only a few survivors to begin anew. Even the remote Inuit of the Arctic speak of the sea rising to swallow the earth, forcing their ancestors into the mountains. In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples remember the dreaming flood, when the ocean rose to cover their coastal hunting grounds. Geologists now know that between 12,000 and 8,000 years before Christus, sea levels rose more than 100 meters, enough to submerge entire continents. Their legends are not myth. They are eyewitness accounts carved into story. Anthropologists have catalogued more than 500 flood traditions worldwide. They vary in detail, but not in meaning. Water as judgment, water as renewal, water as the boundary between one world and the next. How could so many cultures, isolated by oceans, remember the same catastrophe unless their ancestors had lived through it? Perhaps these tales were never meant as warnings from gods, but as messages from survivors. When they told their children of the deluge, they were not explaining morality. They were ensuring remembrance. This happened once, they whispered. It can happen again. Over centuries, those stories grew sacred. Priests turned them into parables, poets into scripture. But beneath every verse still lies the sound of rushing water, the echo of the world that came before. Even now, when we hear the rain against our windows, something ancient stirs within us. A pulse older than language, reminding us of the night the oceans came for the land. And perhaps that memory is why humanity builds, why we seek higher ground, not only to touch the heavens, but to stay above the flood that lives in our collective past. As the flood stories faded into legend, a new kind of guardian emerged, the keepers of memory. They were the priests, the astronomers, the scribes, men and women who believed that the old knowledge, if preserved, could protect the world from repeating its destruction. While kingdoms rose and fell, they carried fragments of a forgotten age in ritual, symbol, and song. It was around 5,000 years before Christus when this quiet order began to take shape. In Sumer, the first temple schools appeared, sanctuaries of learning where priests studied the heavens, the floods, and the movements of time. They mapped the stars with clay tablets, recorded the flow of the rivers, and divided the year into precise cycles. To the people, this was divine wisdom. But behind the hymns and ceremonies, it was remembrance, an attempt to understand what had once destroyed their world. The same pattern unfolded in Egypt. There, the priesthood of Heliopolis taught that the gods had built the first kingdom in the age before the flood, the first time, or Zep Tepi. Within their temples, knowledge was not invented, but restored. They memorized star charts, tracked the rising of Sirius, and timed the Nile's floods with astonishing accuracy. Each calculation was a promise that chaos would not return if order was maintained. In the highlands of Peru, centuries later, the Amautas, teachers of wisdom, guarded similar secrets. They taught that the world had ended and begun again, that the sun had disappeared once before, and that only those who remembered the patterns of the sky could ensure its return. Even far to the east, in the lands of the Indus Valley, the keepers of the Vedas, the early Brahmins, preserved sacred chants describing cycles of destruction and rebirth, measured not in years, but in ages. Their rituals were not superstition. They were mathematics in disguise, frequencies, vibrations, harmonies that echoed the rhythms of the cosmos. Every culture had its guardians, every temple its watchers. The stone tablets, the papyrus scrolls, the hidden chambers beneath ziggurats and pyramids. These were not tombs for kings alone. They were vaults for knowledge, reminders that humanity had once seen the world undone by water, fire, and darkness. Most of these records are lost. Some were burned in wars, others were buried beneath the shifting sands. Yet whispers remain. A word, a symbol, a line of text that feels older than the civilization that wrote it, each one a fragment, a spark from a great fire that once illuminated the earth. And though the names of the priests have faded, their purpose has not. Every age has its guardians of memory, its watchers of the sky, its keepers of forgotten truths. They remind us that knowledge is fragile, and that to forget the past is to invite its return. History, as we know it, is a story written by survivors and edited by time. But what if the story we tell ourselves is incomplete? What if, in our rush to record civilization's triumphs, we erased the memory of what came before? The rewriting of human history did not happen all at once. It began quietly, as memory hardened into myth, and myth into scripture. By 4,000 years before Christus, cities had risen from the dust. Uruk, Memphis, Mohenjo-Daro. They were new, proud, and confident, built by people who believed they stood at the dawn of creation. But their temples and texts told another story, one that reached back to a world long vanished beneath the sea. In Sumer, the scribes of the great ziggurats recorded lists of kings that stretched thousands of years before their own time. Some reigned for centuries, others for millennia. Scholars dismiss these numbers as exaggeration. But what if they are echoes, distorted memories of rulers who lived before the flood? The Sumerians themselves said so. Their tablets state clearly, "Then the flood swept over the earth. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven once more." In that single line, the entire timeline of humanity shifts. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis spoke of divine dynasties, the Necheru, beings who ruled before mortal pharaohs. Later generations reinterpreted them as gods, but the oldest texts describe them as teachers, lawgivers, and builders. Their reigns were measured not in centuries, but in thousands of years before Christus. The pattern was the same: long ages of wisdom, followed by destruction, followed by a new beginning. Yet over time, these records became inconvenient. Empires needed clear origins. Kings needed divine legitimacy. So the old timelines were shortened, the myths simplified, the truths turned into allegory. The chaos before civilization, the floods, the fires, the lost world, was relegated to myth, while human progress was made to look like an unbroken ascent. In the libraries of Babylon, in the archives of Alexandria, and in the temples of Thebes, the rewriting began. The ancient world wanted order, and order required forgetting. To question the past was to question the gods themselves. So the stories of the lost age were sealed away, their meanings buried under new languages and rewritten histories. But every erasure leaves a trace, a date that doesn't fit, a ruin older than it should be, a map that shows a land no longer there. Modern researchers are beginning to notice the cracks, the pieces of history that refuse to conform. Each discovery hints that our timeline is not a straight line, but a circle. If that is true, then history has not been written once, but many times, each age rising, remembering, and forgetting again. And perhaps, beneath all the revisions and retellings, the earth still keeps its own record, written not in ink, but in stone. There comes a moment in every age when the past becomes too heavy to carry, when memory turns from guidance to burden, and so humanity buries it, not always with shovels, but with silence. That is how the story of the forgotten civilization ended. Not with one disaster, but with a slow, deliberate forgetting. By 3,000 years before Christus, the world had become a patchwork of rising empires. Kings ruled from shining cities, priests recorded laws in new languages, and trade carried goods across deserts and seas. The old world was fading into legend. Its ruins were already ancient, its meaning already lost. In Egypt, the desert swallowed what was left of older settlements. Temples built before the pyramids were stripped of their stones to raise new monuments to new gods. The sands covered the rest, sealing them beneath layers of time. To later generations, they were not ruins at all, only hills and dunes without a name. In Mesopotamia, floods from the Tigris and Euphrates buried entire cities in silt. Over centuries, clay tablets, records of astronomy, medicine, and myth, lay crushed beneath new foundations. When those cities fell to war and fire, their libraries burned. The smoke that rose into the sky carried with it 10,000 years of human memory. Farther east, in the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were abandoned. Their streets, once perfectly ordered, fell silent. No one knows why. Perhaps drought, perhaps invasion, or perhaps the earth itself demanded silence again. When explorers rediscovered them thousands of years later, their language was unreadable, their purpose unknown. Even the stars changed. The constellations drifted with the slow turning of the heavens, hiding the alignments that had once guided the builders of the old world. Without the sky as reference, their monuments became meaningless shapes, relics of a forgotten design. The priests who once guarded fragments of ancient knowledge grew fewer. Their students learned new ways, new gods, new tongues. The rituals that once encoded celestial mathematics became empty ceremonies. What had been science became superstition. What had been memory became myth. By the time Homer sang of drowned cities and gods at war, the world had already buried its first history. And the people who walked among its ruins believed themselves to be the first, unaware they were the last of many. It is no wonder the ancients called their flood the Great Forgetting. For when the waters rose, they washed not only the land, but the truth itself. Yet nothing stays buried forever. Wind uncovers, ice melts, stone endures, and somewhere beneath our feet, the echoes of that lost civilization still wait, patient, silent, and unbroken. For centuries, the story of the forgotten age was dismissed as myth. The flood, the fire, the lost world, all said to be the inventions of frightened minds, trying to explain nature's power. But now, as the earth reveals her own memory, science is beginning to whisper something different. The clues are there, and they can no longer be ignored. Deep in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, cores drilled from the frozen ground have captured the breath of ancient air. Within those layers, scientists have found traces of a sudden and violent change around 12,800 years. Before Christus, a massive spike in soot and platinum, the chemical signature of an impact from the sky. This, many believe, marks the beginning of the Younger Dryas, the 1,000-year winter that followed the end of the Ice Age. A catastrophe that reshaped the planet, and perhaps erased a civilization that once thrived. Across North America, archaeologists have uncovered a thin black layer of soil filled with melted glass, carbon spherules, and magnetic grains, debris created by temperatures higher than any volcano could produce. Similar layers have been found in Europe, the Middle East, and even South America, all dated to the same moment in time. Coincidence is possible, but repetition across continents begins to look like evidence. At the same time, the oceans began to rise. Sea levels climbed more than 100 meters in less than 1,000 years. Whole continents vanished beneath the waves, including Doggerland in northern Europe and Sunderland in Southeast Asia. Modern sonar mapping has revealed ancient riverbeds and coastlines now buried under the sea, suggesting that people once lived where only fish now swim. Even the genetic record hints at survival from an earlier age. Researchers studying human DNA have found strange patterns, sudden expansions of population around 10,000 years before Christus, as though humanity were recovering from near extinction. It matches perfectly with the timing of the floods, the fires, and the final collapse of the Ice Age. And then there are the ruins, structures like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Pumapunku in Bolivia, and the underwater city off India's coast, all seemingly older than civilization itself. Each one defies the accepted timeline. Each one suggests that someone, somewhere, remembered how to build before writing even existed. To the cautious mind, these are mysteries. To the curious one, they are invitations. The Earth is telling us that history is deeper than we think, layered, fractured, and incomplete. Perhaps we did not rise once, but many times. Perhaps civilization is not a beginning, but a return. And as we uncover more from the soil, the ice, and the sea, we may find that the myth of the lost world was never myth at all, but memory. For all we have discovered on land, the greatest part of Earth's history lies hidden beneath the waves. More than 2/3 of our planet is covered by ocean, and under that vast expanse of blue, time itself sleeps. If a civilization truly thrived before the floods, then its remains would rest not in deserts or jungles, but beneath the ocean floor. Since the dawn of modern exploration, divers and oceanographers have reported strange shapes in the deep. Stone walls where no mountain stands, terraces and roads far below the reach of sunlight. Each discovery begins as a rumor, a shadow on sonar, and yet, more often than not, the shadows resolve into something real. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, researchers using side-scan sonar found geometric patterns stretching for kilometers beneath the muddy water. Lines and angles no current could have carved. Carbon samples from artifacts retrieved there date to nearly 9,000 years. Before Christus, long before the known cities of the Indus Valley. Marine archaeologist Dr. S.R. Rao called it the oldest submerged city on Earth, though many remain cautious. Still, the shapes are there, blocks, columns, and what might once have been steps leading down into the depths. Thousands of miles away, in the waters around Japan's Yonaguni Island, divers uncovered another enigma, a submerged complex of steps, terraces, and towering walls. It lies 25 meters below the surface, where it could only have been built before the oceans rose, around 10,000 years before Christus. Some call it natural erosion, others call it impossible coincidence. But to those who swim through its corridors, it feels deliberate, the ghost of architecture carved by vanished hands. Even more clues lie hidden in the Black Sea, where marine scientists found the remnants of ancient shorelines and freshwater shells far below modern depths. Proof that the sea once flooded catastrophically around 5,600 years before Christus. The discovery supports an old story told in the region, one of a great deluge that destroyed a land of abundance and forced its people to flee to the west. And these are only fragments. Modern technology has barely touched the ocean floor. Less than 5% of it has been mapped in high resolution. If ruins exist, they could be waiting in silence, cloaked in silt and coral, beneath miles of cold, dark water. The ocean is the keeper of humanity's first chapter. It does not reveal its secrets easily, but as sonar grows sharper and explorers push deeper, the map of the deep begins to look strangely familiar, as though continents lost 12,000 years. Before Christus are slowly rising again, one discovery at a time. Beneath the ocean floor, the past still breathes. And perhaps, one day, when we finally listen closely enough, it will tell us the story of who we really were. Not all memory lives in stories or stone. Some of it lives inside us, written not in words, but in the code of life itself. Our DNA is an archive, a record of what humanity has endured. Every triumph, every catastrophe, every near extinction is written there, passed silently from parent to child. It is the only history that cannot be rewritten. Modern science has begun to uncover what the ancients somehow already knew, that we carry the past within us. Deep in the genetic code of every human being lies evidence of events that shaped not just our world, but our very survival. And when researchers follow those patterns backward, they find something astonishing: a narrowing of humanity's genetic diversity around 12,000 years. Before Christus, the exact moment the Ice Age collapsed and the world changed forever. Geneticists call this a bottleneck, a point in time when our species came close to vanishing. Fewer than 10,000 individuals may have survived, scattered across continents. From them, all modern humans descend. It means that somewhere among those survivors were the last living witnesses of the world before the flood, the bearers of knowledge, the keepers of memory. Even our bodies remember. In times of stress, fear, or famine, our genes still awaken old instincts, echoes of survival learned in ages of darkness. The urge to seek higher ground when water rises. The unease we feel at the sound of distant thunder. These may not be coincidence, but whispers from ancestors who once lived through the storm. Anthropologists studying ancient migrations have traced similar clues. They found that, as the world thawed, humans spread outward from small refuges, along river valleys, through mountain passes, and across newly opened plains. Every step carried fragments of culture, myth, and craft from the age before. It was not just blood that moved, but memory. Some indigenous peoples still speak of these origins. In Australia, elders say their songs are as old as the rising seas that forced their ancestors inland. In Africa, the San people tell of a time when the stars fell and the ground burned. Even in the Arctic, the Inuit remember a night when the sky turned red and the world froze. These stories were never learned. They were remembered, carried inside the very people who told them. Our DNA is the same. It is a biological storybook, written in the language of adaptation, a record of fire, hunger, and hope. It remembers what we have forgotten, and though science reads it in the cold precision of molecules, there is something almost spiritual in what it reveals, that every one of us is a living monument to survival. The flood erased the world, but not humanity. Somewhere, in the quiet turning of our genes, the story continues to whisper. We were there, we endured, we remember. Long after the floodwaters fell and the earth grew calm again, humanity began to build not only for shelter, but for remembrance. Across the continents, in temples, pyramids, and monoliths, they left messages carved into stone, warnings for those who would one day forget. They knew that water and fire would return, and so they wrote in the only language time could not erase. From the jungles of Central America to the deserts of Egypt, the same message appears again and again. The sky has fallen before, and it can fall again. At Göbekli Tepe, carved nearly 12,000 years before Christus, a pillar known as the vulture stone bears strange symbols: a scorpion, a bird, and falling shapes like fragments from the sky. Modern researchers, such as Dr. Martin Sweatman, have suggested that it records a celestial event, perhaps a comet impact, one powerful enough to end an age. If true, it is not only art, but testimony, a message from survivors marking the night the heavens burned. Thousands of years later, the Maya built their temples aligned with the stars, encoding cycles of destruction and renewal. Their calendar predicted cosmic ages lasting roughly 5,000 years, each ending in upheaval, fire, water, or darkness. To them, these were not prophecies, but history repeating. The last great reset, they said, had come by flood. In Egypt, hieroglyphs carved into the walls of Edfu Temple tell of an island where the gods of creation once lived, an island destroyed by fire and water. After its fall, survivors travelled up the Nile, bringing knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and time. To the priests who preserved these stories, the message was clear. Every age ends in disaster, and every civilization is born from the ashes of the last. Even in the Andes, at the temple of Tiahuanaco, carved blocks show celestial markers, solstices, equinoxes, and star alignments that no longer match the modern sky. It is as if the builders were documenting the heavens as they once were, before the tilt of the earth changed, a permanent record of the world that was lost. Across millennia, these monuments became misunderstood. What were once records of survival turned into places of worship. Their warnings became prayers. Their calendars became prophecy. And yet, the message remains carved beneath the dust. Remember what came before. Today, we look upon these carvings with wonder, but rarely with understanding. We see beauty, not urgency, design, not message. But perhaps, if we could read the stones as our ancestors did, we would hear their warning clearly. The earth remembers. It turns in cycles. And every so often, it reminds us, nothing built by humankind lasts forever. Every civilization believes it stands at the center of history. But the earth has never known a single beginning, only cycles. Each age rises from the bones of the one before, flourishes for a moment in sunlight, and then fades into dust. The people of the forgotten world understood this better than we do. They had seen the circle turn once already. Around 12,000 years before Christus, when the ice melted and the seas rose, the world entered a new dawn. To the survivors, it was not the birth of civilization, but its return. And ever since, humanity has lived within that pattern: creation, destruction, renewal. The ancients tried to measure it. In Sumer, priests divided time into great cycles called Sar. spanning thousands of years. In Egypt, they spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, followed by endless repetitions of order and chaos. The Maya recorded entire worlds passing in intervals of 525 years, each ending in catastrophe. Even in India, the Yugas tell of golden ages descending slowly into darkness until the cycle restarts. Different names, same pattern. A clock older than the stars themselves. Science now sees its reflection. Ice cores reveal that the Earth's climate pulses in rhythm. Warm, cold, warm again, driven by subtle shifts in the planet's orbit and tilt. The sun, too, moves through its own cycles of calm and fury. Comets follow paths that return every few millennia, like celestial reminders that the sky remembers. Perhaps this is why the ancients built their monuments to align with the heavens, not just to worship, but to measure. They knew that what comes around will come again. We, too, live in the turning. Our world grows bright with technology, connected by invisible threads of energy and light. Yet beneath the progress, the same forces stir, shifting climates, rising seas, fire in the sky. It feels new to us, but it is only another verse in a song the planet has sung before. Maybe that is what the stones were warning us. Not prophecy, but pattern. They were saying, remember that you are not the first. Remember that the circle always closes. The cycle is not a punishment. It is renewal. When fire comes, the earth cleanses. When water rises, it begins again. And every time humanity climbs back into the light, it carries the faint memory of what was lost. Stories of gods, floods, and stars that fell. We are the latest expression of that memory. The world before us was not truly destroyed. It lives within us, waiting to awaken when the wheel turns once more.